Great, thanks for that introduction. It's quite an act to follow. The panels this morning have just been terrific. I've learned an awful lot. Yes, economists can learn too, or at least we try. I want to thank Janet Friedman here from Rhode Island CRMC, who taught me that Rhode Island is way, way ahead of the rest of the country. Back in the year 2000, I think you were a new employee there. I came down here on some EPA funding to explore how the state policies might impact where people would plan to build in the future, where they might try to put up fortifications against sea level rise and such. And I learned an awful lot about the right way to do things. It took me 15 years to actually put together this presentation, Janet, but I hope it was worth the time. So what I want to do is try to convince you of three main messages. First, I am not a Rhode Islander. I come from that crazy state to the north, Massachusetts, and I work all over the country and all over the world on the economics of adaptation, and in some cases the economics of mitigating climate change. And I think there's some useful lessons for people in Rhode Island, particularly now that you have this opportunity with some of the data and information that's coming out of these storm tools efforts and other things that are being done at CRMC and elsewhere. I think there's actually some useful lessons from the economics work that's been done largely at the national level that's applicable to your adaptation efforts here. I also want to tell you that, having looked at this quite carefully in the last year, these new greenhouse gas reduction actions that are being considered, new rules out of the federal EPA and such, they will reduce the impact of sea level rise and storm surge, but they're not going to be enough, not nearly enough. You will need to adapt. So don't count on those folks working on mitigation to bail you out. And then finally, I want to show you a bunch of evidence that I think shows adaptation has been shown to have been quite cost effective in many contexts. However, with the caveat that you're going to need to start planning now to take advantage of the best opportunities. So one of the efforts that I was involved in at the national scale was the National Climate Assessment. I won't mention that I was also an IPCC co-author, because John has convinced you that the IPCC is right on top of it. I can say there was another working group. I worked on the Impacts and Adaptation Working Group. But I was glad to hear you say, John, that the National Climate Assessment took a more enlightened view and did incorporate what we call dynamic ice sheet melting, or the empirical models of ice sheet melting in thinking about planning. This was a really great group I worked with to develop a chapter in the National Climate Assessment. And there are some really great messages in there. If you get a chance, that chapter is an interesting, and it's meant to be a very short read. It's really targeted towards local and state decision makers. There are 5 key messages, and 2 of them are about economics, because the thinking was we needed to provide something new and fresh in the National Climate Assessment. This is, I think, the 3rd or 4th iteration of the National Climate Assessment. So the idea was, where have we made progress? Well, we made progress in understanding the economic disruption that might result from climate change. So this is one of the key messages directly out of the report. And I think it speaks for itself. I think it's this language is very carefully parsed over a number of editing rounds. So we're all very happy that this group of smiling faces here to stand behind this particular piece. And there's evidence to support this. This is one of the most heavily footnoted documents you'll ever see. If you don't believe us, you can check the literature. So this is now a well-established understanding, at least within the economics discipline. And I thought one of the interesting dimensions from that report that would be interesting to talk about here, since we talked a little bit about ports, is these maps and the text that went along with it that illustrated how much inland parts of the United States are dependent on coastal ports for trade and for economic opportunity. So these are 4 ports that were highlighted in the report. This is a diagram directly out of the National Climate Assessment, and it's striking to me how many of these things stretch all the way across the country. These are essentially truck routes. This is freight that gets trucked from ports across the country to all sorts of different places. These are 4 of the largest ports, but you can actually downscale this quite easily. The Department of Transportation provides information on all this interconnectivity for Rhode Island as well as for all the other parts of the country. And what was very striking as I pulled the Rhode Island data, that you start off with this map, which represents historical information from 2007 about goods that come into the Rhode Island ports and are then sent to other parts of the country. You can see New York and Massachusetts are in brown here because they're major trading partners. That makes sense to me in 2007. But they also made a projection to 2040, and you end up with this map in 2040, which startled me because I was wondering what Southern California wants to bring from Rhode Island. I looked into the data more, and they're manufactured goods from Europe, mainly. So I don't know how they made these projections, but to me, this is a very compelling way for you to illustrate that Rhode Island is having a growing impact on the national economy. So if you're looking for someone to help you pay for upgrades to ports, this is one way to start to say, it's not just Rhode Island that benefits from this. If Rhode Island weren't there, you'd initially see all these places suffering. And then what you'd also see is a less resilient overall East Coast port system, because there's a lot of goods that are traveling across the Atlantic, and if any of the ports on the East Coast go out, all the others are overtaxed in terms of trying to respond. So to me, this is one way that you can start to make the case for some others to start paying for port upgrades in Rhode Island. So I've spent a lot of time in the last year and a half trying to develop a model that for EPA that helps them justify greenhouse gas mitigation policies. And one of the dimensions we've looked at is sea level rise. Fortunately, it wasn't the only one, because the problem with greenhouse gas mitigation and sea level rise, as John explained earlier, is it's a little bit like an aircraft carrier. It's very hard to turn around. There's a lot of momentum, as you said this morning, built up in the oceans. And because of that, greenhouse gas mitigation policy doesn't have a very big effect on damages from sea level rise and storm surge, at least not in the short term. So these are basically discounted estimates of the cumulative effects. And the darker bar, that's a reference business as usual scenario, what sorts of impacts you could expect from climate change, from sea level rise and storm surge. The right bar is how that gets reduced with a very aggressive mitigation policy. And I challenge you from the place that you're sitting to see the difference between those two. There is a difference, but it's hard to see on that scale. These are the numbers, and I'm not going to dwell on this particular table, but this is essentially gives you a sense of what are the economic implications of adapting relative to mitigation. So if you look at the circled numbers on the top, that assumes that everybody does everything they're supposed to do economically, and we've already learned that there's a lot of barriers to doing those sorts of things. You know, it takes a lot of political willpower, for example, to do any kind of managed retreat. But if everybody did those things, you could see effects in a reference business as usual case of $690 billion, and you could reduce that to $669 billion. That's if you do all the good adapting things. But if you don't adapt, you subject yourself to something like $4.2 trillion of damages. Okay, now that's a crazy scenario. That's a silly scenario, right? That's the dumb coastal property owner who doesn't do anything to protect his property, just lets it get inundated and then walks away from it at the last minute. That doesn't actually happen in the real world. But it illustrates to you a very important fact. The difference between those numbers is huge. And that's the first indication that adaptation is a very cost-effective response. So these are national numbers. And just to hammer home this point about mitigation briefly here, these are the cumulative benefits of the mitigation program that EPA has asked us to analyze. And the blue line here is the benefits. Is that working? It's okay. Blue and red are easy to pick up, right? The blue line here is the benefits of the program without adaptation. The red line is the benefits with adaptation. So the first thing to notice is the lines are identical through 2050. In fact, they're pretty close to zero through 2050. Okay, so what does that suggest? That suggests if you're going to justify a program for mitigation, you better have a very low discount rate, because you better be worried about things that happen after 2050. But the other thing this should tell you is if people don't adapt, mitigation will be really valuable because there'll be a lot of bad things going on. So how do we get out of that mess? How do we get out of the situation of saying, you move first on mitigation and then I'll move on adaptation, or the other way around? Who needs to move first? Well, everybody needs to move. So the model that we've developed for the country is one that you can downscale to Rhode Island. But let me just illustrate for one of our more compelling sites. I don't know if Chuck is still here and can find his house. There he is. So this is Tampa. I'm sure you recognize it right away.
Yeah.
This is
safer now.
All right, good, because the red area is the area that's potentially vulnerable to at least a 1 in 100-year storm, okay? Going off into the future, considering the effects of both sea level rise and storm surge together. With Rhode Island's new mapping sources, as Glenn was very kindly pointed out when you look at this slide, this type of analysis can easily be conducted now in Rhode Island locally. But let me tell you what you could do once you start that sort of analysis. If Tampa adapts to these threats, on the left you see what is at risk when we think about sea level rise. At the right, it's sea level rise and storm surge together. And then the bottom set of panels are what happens when you adapt. It's hard to see, but there's because that red area where almost nobody lives, right, Chuck? On the right side really dominates this. But there's a big difference in what actually is vulnerable when you do adapt. So how would you do this kind of analysis in Rhode Island? Well, I was sitting in my colleague's office the other day, who happens to be a Rhode Islander. He's from Pawtucket, I think. And I saw this poster on his wall. I don't know if any of you have seen it before. And I started daydreaming and looking at it and said, wow, this is all coastal stuff. I mean, basically, the icons that people respond to in Rhode Island, this doesn't need to be reinforced to any of you, but to me, it was sort of a kick in the head. They're all coastal icons. What people really care about are the coastal icons. And what my friend cares about is Aunt Carrie's, which is in the bottom left. I don't know why he doesn't go to Iggy's, which I think is like across the street in Narragansett. So maybe there's a fight there that I don't know about, so I'm not going to go too far into it. But this, pardon?
All about the clam cakes.
Clam cakes and donuts? Is that right? Anyway, I have an internet knowledge of these places, and that's about it. But that type of thinking is actually exactly what you need to do if you want to do an economic analysis that's compelling to people in terms of taking adaptation action now. So think about the vulnerable assets in Rhode Island. My model spends a lot of time worrying about property and what's affected, and a little bit of time worrying about infrastructure. Those are actually really important things to think about at the local level, infrastructure in particular. There's a place that the economics hasn't gone yet, but it's right to go, which is thinking about secondary and indirect effects. So we've heard business interruption mentioned, which is super important at the local and the individual establishment level. Power outages and electric grid failure. This is a place where my EPA sponsors are actually pushing us now, mainly because of the experience in Sandy, which was really well illustrated by our Hoboken guest here. Recreation resources, those have to be valued not just from the standpoint of how they contribute to property values, but also how they contribute to local revenues, their fiscal impact. That hasn't been done yet. And ecological resources, we saw the SLAM modeling. It's been talked about a few times here. You're way ahead of other states in doing that SLAM modeling. And in fact, there are economic tools that can be connected to wetland resources. You can be looking at whether the places where wetlands want to go are places that you would be very loath to give up, and therefore you want to build a hard structure, and that says the wetland won't survive, or whether there's actually corridors in which those wetlands can migrate. Those are the sorts of analysis you can start to do. So I did downscale some of my results for Rhode Island, but I'm going to skip through them really quickly because I'm almost out of time, which is great because these don't downscale very well. This was a national analysis, and in order to do something like this well, you really need local folks to tell you all the things you did wrong. So this basically on the left shows you the areas at risk of sea level rise. That's only sea level rise in Rhode Island in the 4 coastal counties here. And then the adaptation response to sea level rise. So we have a model which, if it's fed with the right data, can give you a sense of the decision process that private and public folks who worry about this and who might take a benefit-cost perspective, what they would decide to do in terms of a response. Should they retreat? Should they build a seawall? Should they do beach nourishment? Should there be just elevation because it's an episodic storm surge issue? And that's something that can be picked up with a private incentive if the incentives are effectively communicated. So we also have some numbers for Rhode Island, and these are terrible, so I'm going to go through this really fast. The main reaction I get when I show this to folks who know Rhode Island is, why are the bars in Providence County so low? They should be much higher. And I think that's because we had to extrapolate storm surge from, we could only do 17 locations throughout the country. So we did do Barnstable County, but when we extrapolated, we didn't extrapolate, on the shoulder of the Barnstable County storm surge model. That would have been a big mistake. We're not capturing the local effects here well enough, but you're ready to. The maps that I've seen already today, the ones I saw last night, suggest that you could take what is essentially a very simple model at this point that EPA has spent a lot of time investing in, and apply your own maps with this economic framework and get a better sense of where are the areas that are most at risk, how does that risk change with adaptation. So I'm going to talk now, in 30 seconds, I'm going to give you a quick tour of 3 other national analyses that you need to be aware of, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about them in the question and answer section. One is the Risky Business Report. We heard a little bit about it this morning. There was one component of it where Risk Management Solutions, which works with the insurance industry, examined what's at risk with no adaptation. But the fact is, you really do need to think about adaptation in this context. And so we did an analysis that supplemented that for the Next Generation Foundation that looked at 4 tiers of adaptation options. And the second one is the one I want to draw attention to, individual property owner action only. You can layer on that then collective action. As you think about these tiers, it's really important. It's a really good structured way to think about what incentives you need to set up, both for individual action and then for collective action. But one of the key findings is the overall costs increase as the options available to adapt decrease. That's sort of simple economics, right? You increase your opportunity set, you have more options for trying to respond, then you do better. But the startling finding was that the no adaptation option is 4 to 6 times worse than the full adaptation option. So there's another study I want to talk about from the Gulf Coast that has basically established a bit of a rule of thumb that says if you invest in adaptation, for every $1 you invest in adaptation, you get $4 in payoff. Well, that's not exactly right, because it's not every $1 that you invest. It's the well-targeted, in fact, almost perfectly targeted $1 that you invest. So this is a study by, mainly by Entergy down in the Gulf Coast, where they looked at their vulnerable resources, and then they developed this adaptation cost curve. And they said, okay, the cost-effective adaptation options, which are to the left of this graph, those things bias this 4-to-1 ratio. If we went whole hog on adaptation and couldn't tolerate any what we call residual risk, that is, if we tried to adapt fully, then we'd spend an awful lot of money doing so, and it may not be cost effective. This is one way you can get across to folks that, in fact, full adaptation isn't feasible. It's not economically possible. You're never going to find the resources to pursue something that has a cost-benefit ratio of, what is that, 8.5, right? That means $8.5 invested to get $1 in return. And by the way, you saw the return comes after a long waiting period, so the return on investment is infinitesimal. Okay, another piece I want to just mention to you, because we talked about the option of closing off Narragansett, or some folks have talked about this option of closing off Narragansett Bay. This is an interesting study in Science that's worth looking at. It looked at potentially building a barrier across from New York to New Jersey. First, you got to get those 2 states to cooperate, but on something other than the path. And I'm from New Jersey, so I know a little bit about this. The 2 really important insights there: no strategies that they looked at here, and particularly not this big gate, were cost-effective under current climate. So the incentive in New York, and I don't actually think that's true here, but it's worth some evaluation. There basically are not benefits of this type of major infrastructure program until you start thinking about climate change and sea level rise. And I think, you're definitely going to see here, if you incorporate climate change on these sorts of projects and sea level rise, you will see their benefit cost ratios go up a lot. This went from not cost effective to having a 3-to-1 benefit to cost ratio once they considered reasonable projections of sea level rise. So now I'm really wrapping up. The take-home message is, don't assume you can adapt to all climate change. There's going to be residual risks. The U.S. is highly vulnerable in economic terms to lots of coastal threats. Mitigating greenhouse gases will reduce that threat, but it's going to take a lot of time to have a significant impact, so you can't count on it. Adaptation is a cost-effective option, particularly in densely populated areas like the areas we were talking about in the last panel. And finally, the sooner you start, the better off you'll be. It takes time to make sure that the incentives for private action are well recognized, well realized. I think the insurance speaker we have coming up next, I hope, will touch on some of how insurance actually sets up some of those private incentives. It takes a lot of time for governments to cooperate and build these sort of bigger infrastructure alternatives. So thanks very much for your attention.